Do you know the judicial branch? Yeah, I thought you didn't.
This is Crash Course Government, and today we're going to be talking about the judicial branch. Before the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation were in effect. This meant there was no national judiciary. This time was between 1781 and 1789. Laws were interpreted and applied by each state differently. Often decisions made in one court were ignored by the others. The framers created a national judiciary for the United States with Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution. Courts are divided into state and federal courts. The federal courts span over 100 courts, however, each state has its own system of courts. The Constitution creates the Supreme Court, but lets Congress create the inferior court. These inferior courts are beneath the Supreme Court. Congress has created two types of these inferior courts: constitutional courts and the special courts. Some constitutional courts are the Court of Appeals and district courts. The constitutional courts are the main ones, and the special ones only hear a narrow range of cases, so they're less important. There are 94 district courts and 12 U.S. Court of Appeals. The constitutional courts hear most of the cases in federal court. They have jurisdiction over them. Jurisdiction is having authority to hear and decide a case. The Constitution gives federal courts the power to hear a case because of the subject matter or the parties involved. Cases not heard by federal courts are within the jurisdiction of the states. Federal courts have several types of jurisdiction. These include exclusive, concurrent, original, and appellate jurisdiction. Exclusive jurisdiction is cases that can only be heard in federal courts. An example of this would be a trial of a person charged with a federal crime or a patent or copyright case. Many cases can be tried in a federal or state court. This is known as concurrent jurisdiction and is more common. The federal and state courts share the power to hear cases. An example of this would be a case involving a dispute involving citizens of different states. Original jurisdiction is when the court in which a case is being heard for the first time. Appellate jurisdiction is when a court hears a case on an appeal from a lower court. The federal district courts have only original jurisdiction, and the Court of Appeals have only appellate jurisdiction. The Supreme Court is the only court that is specifically created by the Constitution. The Supreme Court is the last decision in any and all questions of federal law. Most federal and state courts may exercise judicial review. This is the power to decide the constitutionality of an act of government. Even though state and federal courts can exercise this power, the ultimate use of the power rests with the Supreme Court. This leaves the Supreme Court the final authority on the meaning of the Constitution. The Supreme Court first exercised judicial review in the case of Marbury v. Madison. The Supreme Court has both original and appellate jurisdiction. However, most of the cases are heard on an appeal from a lower court.
Now we will be discussing how the Supreme Court justices are elected. First, the President selects a candidate they wish to be on the court. Then the Senate reviews and confirms the candidate onto the court.
The Senate will decide your fate.
I am the Senate.
One recent example is Neil Gorsuch, who was nominated by our new president, Donald Trump. He was confirmed by the Senate and was replacing Justice Scalia, who died February 2016. The justices on the court have a lifetime term, but can be either impeached or retire or die to stop serving on the court. The judicial branch is talked about in Article 3 of the Constitution. In this section, they talk about how the federal court system is laid out and how the Supreme Court is laid out and structured. We did already talk about how it is structured, but for another review, we have at the top, we have the Supreme Court, which is only one of them. Then we have the Court of Appeals, and there are 13 of them in total. Then, at the bottom, we have federal district courts, where there are almost 100 of them across the United States. Also, in the section of the Constitution, it lays out the power of the Supreme Court. Now we will be talking about how the power has increased in the judicial branch. At first, they didn't start out with the power of judicial review, but in the case of Marbury versus Madison, it established their power to do that. We will be talking about that case later in more detail. Also, as the Supreme Court sets more precedents and reviews more larger, more influential cases, their power will grow with how many people realize what they do and how much power they do have. Now, we look at precedents. We mentioned it briefly earlier, but to go into more detail, precedents are what is set by the Supreme Court anytime they make a ruling on a case. One very important one is the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, which we looked at earlier. In this case, it helped establish the Supreme Court's ability for judicial review. This helped the Supreme Court have almost as much power as the other branches of government and put them more equal with everyone else. Another case is Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963. This case was a case of a man, Mr. Gideon, who robbed a pool hall. He was not provided a lawyer in this case because the Florida judge said he couldn't.
I said I want you to appoint a lawyer to represent me in this trial.
Mr. Gideon, I'm sorry, but I cannot appoint counsel to represent you in this case.
He then brought it to the Supreme Court, and they said that everyone has the right to an attorney no matter what. This is a great example of federalism, which is the equal and separation of the federal and state levels of the government. This showed that the federal government constitution has more power than the state constitution and that every state must follow it. Going along with federalism, the case of McCullough versus Maryland in 1819 is another great case of federalism and how it has changed. In this case, it helped establish the necessary and proper clause in the legislative branch, which is giving them the power, the legislative branch, to do things that aren't explicitly written out in the Constitution. This also showed how the federal government does have overruling power over the state government. In this case, the state of Maryland was trying to tax a federal thing, but they can't do that because the federal government has more power over the state. So, thank you for watching this Unit 5 review of the judicial branch, and good luck on the HSA Miss White's 2B American Government class.
Thank you.